There are precursors to forgiveness, I believe. I can think of three right off the bat. One of them is humility. The second would be training at some very basic level in mindfulness. And the third that I have seen is gratitude.
I'm your host, Eileen Borris, and I'd like to welcome you to Political Forgiveness, Voices of Peace, where forgiveness and political forgiveness intersect to create a better world. Since this podcast is about the power of forgiveness, I thought it would be very befitting to have as my first guest someone who has dedicated his adult life to the study of forgiveness and the transformative effects it could have on someone's life. And so I'd like to welcome Dr. Fred Luskin, who not only lives and breathes forgiveness, but who's also a dear friend of mine. Dr. Luskin is the director of the Stanford University Forgiveness Projects. He's also the author of the best-selling books Forgive for Good and Forgive for Love, and a new one just coming out, Forgive for Recovery Workbook. His book, Forgive for Good, is the best-selling self-help book published on the topic of forgiveness. These are just a few of his accomplishments. So I'd like to welcome Fred.
Thank you, Eileen.
You and I have talked a lot about grievances, and it feels like grievance has come to define our current culture and politics, both on the left and right. There's a lot of unhealed emotions, destroying relationships, including family members, cutting off ties with one another, and reducing people to just their vote. I was reading a story about Monica Guzman, the senior fellow at Braver Angels, a nonprofit organization really committed to bridging the political divide. Guzman shared this story about meeting with a group of her friends in Seattle. Guzman is liberal who voted for Biden and Clinton, and her parents are conservative, supporting Trump all the way. So when Guzman got together with her friends, she started feeling queasy and uncomfortable when people were describing the supporters of Trump as monsters, and jokes were being made about Trump supporters, and other things were being said, alluding to the Trump supporters as being ignorant and uncaring and immoral. I think you get the picture of what's going on here. Even Guzman herself got caught up in all of this, and she was laughing along with others, but she knew something was wrong. She understood that saying things about others was actually harmful, not just attacking the other side, but attacking how we relate to others, which in turn became an attack on ourselves. Guzman also felt that an attack on Trump supporters was an attack on her parents, people she deeply loved. And you hear these stories and recognize we need to grow in our own emotional maturity. We have to learn how to behave with one another, especially within our circle of family and friends, in a way that is healing, that doesn't destroy relationships. And if we don't like the way someone voted, that's our problem, not theirs. So a little understanding can go a long way. How does forgiveness, and especially what you teach, fit into this picture?
You know, Eileen, I came up with similar understandings as the woman you quoted many years ago around George Bush and the Iraq War. I remember I live in the San Francisco Bay Area at Stanford University, and I used to kid that in my zip code, if the Democrats ran Attila the Hun and the Republicans ran Gandhi, it would be a close contest. The bias was so intensive. But I remember having a similar experience when friends of mine were insulting George Bush and his crew. And something clicked in me that these are liberals who would be against hate speech, but not against their own. Like they were doing hate speech, but they didn't see that they were doing hate speech, but they were the kind of people for whom hate speech was a big issue. And it struck me the blindness of our own harsh, righteous judgments. They come with moral fervor, but also moral blindness. That became part of what I taught for the last 20 years. You need to implicitly forgive a world where people are going to disagree with you about everything. That's part of what it takes to be a mature adult.
The other thing that is required is for us to really become aware of our own judgments and perceptions.
2 days ago, I met a friend who is more red than blue. And he was talking about the fires in Los Angeles. Unfortunately, our political culture has devolved so much that it's full of blame and hostility. He was blaming the Democratic governor, Gavin Newsom. There was very little empathy for the people whose lives are ripped apart. It was all part of this war. And that is so common almost everywhere I go, that the other side are not real people. Politicians use human suffering to demonize people who disagree with them. And the deep human need for kindness and compassion get lost.
I think that is so sad. What's happening to civility in our civil society? What is happening to empathy for one another and really caring about one another?
And as you said, the bad news is that each of us has to watch our speech, not just them.
When we all have to watch our perceptions and our judgments, and we are so unaware of them. We have to recognize how unaware we really are until we're placed in a situation where our thoughts get triggered about something. We can't know what our perceptions are and our judgments. We need to really learn about mindfulness and watch what we're doing and what we're thinking as we get involved with, quote, the other.
Well, you're a psychologist like I am. Decades ago, we would have learned something of cognitive behavioral therapy, and the pronouncements of Albert Ellis, who started the field, where he said, look at the intensity of your negative emotion. So if you're sad, you probably have a reasonable thought. If you're depressed, you probably have crazy thoughts. If you're frustrated, you probably have reasonable thoughts. If you're outraged or fiercely angry, you have crazy thoughts. I think that's true politically. Like we can know if our blood pressure is 200 over 140 while we're talking about Donald Trump, then we have judgmental, irrational thoughts going through our head. We're probably a part of the problem, not only a part of the solution.
How would you define forgiveness? If we just stop people randomly on the street and ask people what they think of forgiveness, how would they define it? We would get all kinds of answers. How would you define it?
There are two that make sense to me. One of them is giving up all hope for a better past. That's probably the simplest and clearest about the past. About the present, forgiveness is making peace with your life. It's making peace with the life that you had and have. Both of those together are a full picture of forgiveness. Like You stop fantasizing about how the past should have been, and you work more to be at peace with the life that you're actually leading. The space between where you were and the better state, that space is forgiving.
A great way of looking at it. I talk about it as the decision that we make. Instead of seeing the world through anger, we see it through understanding.
Anger and self-pity. It's
Right,
not just anger.
right,
The-
right.
There's a tremendous overuse of victimhood now that is full of self-pity, manipulates the self-pity. So it's not just anger.
I totally agree. Our ego thought system, we just want to walk around as victims. We don't see it, we don't recognize it, but we play the victim role. And you're right, it's poor me, poor me. And as long as we're stuck in that, we're also stuck in the past. We don't want to move forward in a way where our lives become much more joyful and fulfilling.
From my understanding, victim status is necessary for a short period of time. You have to have a safe perch where you can say, this wasn't my fault. I was crossing the street. The guy came out of nowhere and hit me. I am a victim of that person's bad driving. But that's a temporary space to recollect your thoughts and emotions so that you can start again making peace with your life. It's not that victimhood is wrong, it's just not skillful long term. Same thing with anger. It is very helpful to be angry for a while because one, you're identifying a cause, but two, you're giving yourself time and space to adapt.
It's like when I'm working with the clients I work with forgiveness, I always say you can't skip any steps.
That's it.
You got to be able to tell your story and feel those emotions because they are telling you something. And when we can begin to understand what our anger is saying, we're growing and learning. And so that's really the first part of, in my mind, a forgiveness process for those who want to heal and really learn how to forgive.
There are situations which we didn't initiate the badness or the problem.
Right.
The difficulty comes in, even if that's true, you don't have to be a victim of that moving forward. You can be an active creator in a life.
Mhm.
And that's our work, is to help people go from helpless victim to more active co-creator. And the life that they're living includes things that were very painful.
It also empowers us and it reminds us we have agency.
Of course.
I'm thinking now in a political forgiveness framework that we as individuals learn how to forgive. And how does that begin to affect our community? And why is that important to be able to have a positive effect on our community? So we stop this piece of grievance, for example, within the community.
Well, I remember, what, 15 years ago, that in that Amish community where that guy came in and shot all those kids. I was involved a little because of my forgiveness expertise. What people told me was the Amish community taught their young people to forgive. They lived the teachings of Jesus. Throughout school, they learned forgiveness, and in the Amish community, some of the heroes were not Rambo type action heroes, but people who forgave, had mercy, and showed compassion. Kids were taught that they were heroic also.
It was an incredible story, and I think it had its power because most of the world doesn't think like that. Illustration of what happens when people are taught about forgiveness early on, that it becomes part of their thinking, And
Exactly.
as a result, when something horrific happens, their default isn't anger. I'm sure they had strong emotions, but it was also, we've got to look at this and learn how to forgive it for us.
We used to refer to it as putting forgiveness on your menu.
Exactly. Another way I look at it is the importance of practicing forgiveness daily. And I don't know about you, Fred, but every single day there's something that kind of gets into my craw. I have to remind myself, hey, you got to practice forgiveness here.
Eileen, it's a good day if there's only one.
I think it's probably more than one.
I mean, what are you kidding? With my long-term partner, I proactively practice forgiveness all the time. The other day, we were on the phone, and I believed that she said the absolute wrong thing, and maybe objectively she did, but I found myself getting riled up, and I have nothing to be gained by getting riled up about her. So inside of my head, I said, I fully and completely forgive you.
The important piece that you saw is why get riled up? Life is too short.
I'm not going to change anything. I'm not leaving the relationship. She's not going to change because I don't like something about her. I've spent a good amount of effort trying to get her to be more the way I want her to be, and it hasn't worked.
Think about that, right?
So this is 10 years into a relationship, and I'm now actively reminding myself, Fred, just let it go, or forgive her, or forgive yourself, but just be at peace.
And it might also be recognizing that the reason why people say and do things, especially things we may not like, is because they're coming from their place of woundedness. And you don't want to kick a dog when they're down.
Well, sometimes they're right and I'm wrong, and I don't
Mhm.
even know it.
Right.
It
Correct.
may be my place of woundedness that has me react, not necessarily them.
And that's where the awareness comes in.
You know, what you're trying to do is an edge in the forgiveness world of applying it more broadly. Not just about me and my partner, but exploring it as part of a political process or as a cultural process. There's a lot less work on that.
And that's why your story about the Amish in Nickel Mines, Pennsylvania was so poignant, because it really showed that if individuals can learn how to forgive, the next step is to really be talking about this in the community so people really understand what is forgiveness and what does this look like and how do we practice it and experience it. So when things happen in the community, like in nickel mines, the people came together and yes, they were angry and yes, they were mourning and yes, they were grieving. And yes, they also went to the widower of the person who did that horrific event in the schools at nickel mines. They went and they expressed their sympathy to the wife whose husband committed all of that. And they came together as a community. The power in that is the healing also
Uh,
becomes far greater.
it's incredible. In our particular dysfunctional world, red and blue or progressive versus MAGA, it's really hard to get people to see past their tribes. That's why I think this forgiveness stuff is so important to try to seed it. It's one of the components that the human race is going to need to do itself better. There's some social science research that if you show a Democrat fact sheets written by Democrats that are wrong, and you show them a fact sheet written by a Republican that's right, they tend to choose the Democratic fact sheet. It's the same for the Republicans, exactly the same on the other side. They did research when Trump won the election in 2016 that freshmen in Ivy League schools didn't want to have roommates who voted for Donald Trump. So you think of what a disordered culture we're living in, that 18-year-olds going away to college wouldn't even want to listen to people who didn't vote for somebody that they thought would vote for. So this question of how do we teach people to like have more mercy and forgiveness is a tough question.
Well, the other interesting thing is for those who actually want to sit down and have a mindset of curiosity, there's so much you can learn about one another that can actually be bonding, and everybody gains. But you've got to be willing to put your thoughts aside and really listen with curiosity, because we all learn and there's shades of truth everywhere you go. It is important to be willing to listen. When I think about what I'm trying to do with political forgiveness, it's to teach people about how to let go of their grievances, how to let go of their petty angers, how to use these skills in their everyday life. This is not esoteric, this is not religious, this is very practical. And then how do we start applying this to the people in our lives? How can we really listen deeply to one another and talk to one another with curiosity and then practice it? And that's really what political forgiveness is also about, practicing these skills.
Well, it's necessary as we see the consequence of having the opposite.
How do you think we can reduce polarization in our society?
There are precursors to forgiveness, I believe. I can think of three right off the bat. One of them is humility. As an unforgiving person, there's a strong belief that you're just right and that the other side or whoever hurt you is simply wrong. And there's so much social science research that we are so much less accurate than we'd like to believe. Our perceptual viewpoints are wrong so often, but the positive quality of humility would be necessary. The second would be training at some very basic level in mindfulness to be aware of our thinking. Like, you have to have some inner awareness, some understanding that we have processes that we can alter. And the third that I have seen is gratitude. If you can just show people how much goodness is in their lives, they're going to be a little less hostile and harsh to the things that aren't as good. But our negativity bias and a dysfunctional culture focus so much on what's wrong. And that's how both sides maintain their grievances. That the other side is not just dangerous, but we're in deep trouble all the time, and all this terrible thing is going to happen, whether it's white supremacy or the world is falling apart. But there's such an unwillingness to open to the beauty of life and the preciousness of it and the gratefulness for it so that we can more easily hold suffering.
It's interesting when I think about those qualities, which I think are incredibly necessary. If we can practice humility, mindfulness, and gratitude, what that also does for us is create a different mindset as to how we view the world. I think that's
Exactly.
really part of what forgiveness is all about.
It is. I've teased apart some of the building blocks that make forgiveness more possible. You know, Eileen, one of the things that I think you and I have struggled with trying to teach this stuff for a long time is forgiveness is an advanced skill.
Mhm.
It's not an easy skill to just come at people and say, hey, pick this up. It requires building blocks that many people don't have. You know, they may not have been raised in homes where they were listened to, or they may not have had safety growing up, or their culture may have been filled with grievance. And to teach them mindfulness sometimes is a necessary precursor to forgiveness, or that cognitive stuff, which is if you have emotions that are way harsh, you can know for sure you're thinking in a certain way, you're catastrophizing or you're labeling or something. But for people like us, we have to be aware of what an advanced skill set forgiveness is.
When you have these building blocks, the depth of forgiveness becomes greater and more transformative. And that brings you down to the spiritual essence of what forgiveness is all about. And the deeper we can go, the more transformative it is and the more beautiful it becomes.
We found in our work that a third of what we were doing was simply helping people understand what forgiveness is and is not. They would come in with turn the other cheek, or it means to forgive and forget, or it means that I have to go back and join the guy who beat me, or it means that I condone violence. The average participant literally had no idea what forgiveness was.
And that's why this is so important. What would you like to leave the audience listening to this podcast? What would you like to say to them to remember about our conversation today?
When people ask me that question, I have different things pop into my head, but the two that come to me now, the first is a direct result of the research we've done. Forgiveness is a teachable skill. It's not esoteric. It doesn't mean you have to go into a monastery. It's something that can be taught and practiced. So the book that you've written, the books that I've written, you can pick up something and learn how to do this. The other one is when you look at research on what are the qualities that make a long-term successful intimate partnership, forgiveness is right there. People think it's how we negotiate sex or money, but those aren't always in the top five, and forgiveness almost always is, which is if you're going to spend a lot of time with another flawed human being, and you are a flawed human being, you're not going to make it last unless both of you forgive each other. And that is a very powerful reminder of the value of forgiveness. It's involved in any long-term important relationship because people are difficult.
We all are.
Yes.
How has this work changed your life?
That's so hard to answer because I'm such a different person than who I was when I started. The constant reminding of myself and other people to let resentment go and to open back up to life, that has changed me. I'm kinder, I'm less reactive. I'm by no means perfect, but the repetition and the investment in that slowly over time change my way of being in the world. So I'm quicker to apologize. I'm quicker to say I'm sorry. I accept people's apology more readily. You know, it's easier for me to find empathy after I've been upset. It's like a slow drip, 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 drip of practice. I made a commitment to that and it slowly unfolds.
If people wanted more information about your work, what's the best way for them to get in touch with you?
FredLuskin.com is my website, but if you just Google Fred Luskin, there's access to 100 YouTube videos and articles, and I'm not hard to find.
That's so true. And it's a treat to Google you and to watch some of those YouTubes and to learn. It's a lot of fun. Well, Fred, it's been a total delight.
Good luck with your work and the podcast.
Thanks so much.
Thank you for joining us in listening to Political Forgiveness, Voices of Peace, where I hope you were inspired by the work of forgiveness in creating social change. If you know of anyone who would find this episode helpful, please share it. For more information on political forgiveness, please visit my website, drborris.com, where you can find all the resources mentioned in the podcast, as well as sign up for the newsletter with the latest information on political forgiveness.